The title is the topic. Today I'm talking about indirect defense. Sometimes I see videos by odysee or Keesian supporters that, for instance, talk about something she's talking about, but it comes across as actually trying to defend her work indirectly, and that's what I feel is happening with Innuendo Studios' video, A Single Study in Germany, Video Games and Cultivation Theory. This is my response to his video.
It's possible by now you've heard of a study making the rounds that claims to have found no connection between video games and sexist attitudes. Perhaps you saw a link attached to a sentence like, John McIntosh's entire body of work is based on a lie. The people circulating this study are insisting that it officially disproves cultivation theory.
I don't disagree with your premise about people implying that study completely disproves cultivation theory. The issue I have is a few seconds in, and you are already linking those criticisms to Jonathan McIntosh's work. Even if you may be technically right, by the end of this video you will better understand why I take issue with any indirect defense of his and odysee or Keesian's work.
Now, something you may have noticed if you clicked the link is that it takes you here to the study's abstract. And you may have noticed there is no link on this page to the full report, which does give me the impression that a lot of people talking about this study haven't actually read it.
The thing I've noticed is people on both sides don't tend to read studies or fully understand them if the talking points support what they believe. When I first watched your video, I was actually interested in your breakdown because few people actually break down a study like this and point out the flaws.
As of recently, I have read it. So let's engage sincerely with this question. Does this study disprove cultivation theory? There are a couple of answers to that, and the first one is no, because it can't.
That is true, but as the study says, it's talking about sexist attitudes. If it's talking about sexist attitudes you might develop from video games, it at least implies you may not cultivate as much negative views from video games as what some imply.
It's important to understand that cultivation theory is not a new radical concept being pushed by a fringe group of third-wave feminists. It's nearly 50 years old, it's broadly taken seriously by academics, and is the third most cited theory in mass media studies. Saying half a century of research has been debunked by a single study is like when people point to a single guy who raised 1,000 generations of peppered moths that never mutated and say it disproves evolution.
So far, I don't disagree with what you are saying, so carry on.
The claim has never been that these phenomena will always occur and that they can be disproved by one instance of not occurring. It's just that they exist at all and that they're important. The second answer to does this study disprove cultivation theory is also no, because it's not actually trying to. This study takes it as a given that cultivation theory is true and is testing whether or not it's present under certain conditions.
Which is where we're going to start disagreeing on what you're getting at. This study is on video games. Video games are not a traditional form of media. Most of what we understand about cultivation theory derives from traditional forms of media. Correlation does not prove causation. If the study of video games was not necessary, they wouldn't do it. And Tropes versus Women in Video Games is about just that. Video games.
It cites some of the research, it explains some of the theory, it discusses a bit of the debate around the theory's application and whether or not it should properly be called a theory. But this is not a study about whether or not cultivation theory is real. And by its own admission, it is testing only for certain specific cultivation effects. By its own admission, it is only testing a very narrow age group. And by its own admission, its findings are not applicable outside of Germany, where the study was conducted.
I could make an equally compelling list of limitations in the studies Anita uses. One of the biggest ones being is they are short-term studies. This German study you cite spans a longer time frame than most studies on video games.
The relevant questions in this field do not include does cultivation theory exist, but rather under what circumstances does it happen, what effect does it have, and how strong is the effect.
The circumstances being video games, as opposed to the explanation of cultivation theory you are about to go into.
I guess we should talk about what cultivation theory actually is. Now, I'm not an authority here, being that I'm not a sociologist, but then if you're dismissive of cultivation theory, you probably aren't a sociologist either. The original formulation of the theory in the 60s came from some studies arguing that in many, but not all cases, the more television people consumed, the more their understanding and beliefs about the world started to mirror those of TV programs.
The original formulation derived from television.
The broader application used now for not just TV, but movies, the internet, video games, and commercials is the media you consume can affect your worldview. That's what the research says.
The broader application. The problem is taking this theory derived from other forms of media and applying it to video games, which is one of the youngest forms of media that they are still studying. I'm not denying the possibility of cultivation theory in video games. I'm saying not everything studied in traditional media can just be applied to an interactive medium like video games.
What a lot of lay people hear, especially in the gaming community, is something like violent TV makes you kill people or sexist video games make you hate women. They think the person speaking is a scaremongering idiot like Jack Thompson, that 90s lawyer who campaigned to censor video games because he argued Grand Theft Auto caused school shootings and a bunch of other bullshit. And no matter how many ways critics phrase this, people consistently hear these.
I agree with your notion that there are overreactionaries who only hear what they want to hear, but there is also a problem with ideologues telling people what they want them to hear, such as with Jack Thompson. And it's not just the message, sometimes it's how it's delivered.
But Jack Thompson's horrible misapplication of cultivation theory was never taken seriously by academics, nor was it taken seriously by any major game publisher or, for that matter, any judges. While he sparked a lot of conversation about whether or not games should be censored, there was very little threat that they actually would be.
The problem we face today is self-censorship. Going back almost a year, a petition came out. Target, withdraw Grand Theft Auto 5. This sickening game encourages players to commit sexual violence and kill women. They handpick what is capable in the game and convince people it is misogyny, sexist, violence against women, even though you can do the same violence against men. This was enough for Target in Australia to pull the game from store shelves, despite the fact there wasn't any real proof this game is harmful the way the petition implies. We are growing into a society that convinces people to self-censor for the fear of what might happen, or the possibility you could hurt someone's feelings. It's not the kind of censorship Jack Thompson was aiming for, but the irony of these tactics are that ideologues like Jonathan McIntosh can eliminate games they don't like, but still claim they weren't technically censored, since the company decided to pull the game off store shelves themselves.
Really, the gaming community needs to follow in the footsteps of the Florida Bar Association and let Jack Thompson go. Because this sentence is not very controversial. Like, this is not just modern feminism and media studies. This is a core conceit of war propaganda, of political speechifying, of modern psychology, and, of course, advertising. When Don Draper says selling you a Kodak slide carousel really means selling you nostalgia for your childhood, this is what he's doing. Every year, people spend billions on the assumption that the right collection of sounds and images can influence what you think and how you feel about things. And the data tends to bear this out. For instance, the candidate who wins the election is usually the one who spent the most money on self-promotional media.
The media you consume can affect your worldview. I could make the same argument with Anita Sarkeesian's video, Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, or the war on women narrative that is pushed so heavily by the media.
What cultivation theory isn't is inception. It doesn't say that violent TV will make you violent. What it does say is the more violent TV you watch, the more violent you may believe the real world actually is, even if the crime rate is dropping. And yes, this is backed up by research.
The more harmful you convince people games are, even if you can't technically prove that to be true, the more they will believe it to be true.
If you're not a violent person, that may make you unnecessarily fearful about, say, letting your kids play outside. If you're already a violent person, it may make you feel more empowered to act on your violent urges because you think they're more culturally acceptable than they are. And nobody ever said it was true for everybody. It varies from person to person and from show to show. The best distillation of cultivation theory may come from the title of a paper on the subject. Some genres have some effects on some viewers.
As it does from show to show, it also varies from one type of media we consume to the next, hence they are studying video games.
It's just that when popular media is consumed by literally billions of human beings, some genres having some effects on some viewers can significantly impact society. And to be clear, that's neither good nor bad. It's just a thing. People absorb cultural narratives from dozens of sources. Media can be an important factor, but it is just one factor. And that one factor can be negative or positive. It is widely believed that a major contributor to the Ku Klux Klan's resurgence in 1915 was due to their sympathetic portrayal in D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. And it's widely believed a contributor to their decline in the 40s was their mocking portrayal in the Superman radio serials. And let's please keep in mind that gamers ate this shit up when Jane McGonigal said that video games could make you a better person. They only started crying foul when feminist critics argued, well, if they can make us better, they are at least capable of making some of us worse. Then everyone went apeshit and said, let's just forget the whole thing then. And before anyone says, that's not fair, Jane McGonigal talks about mechanics while Anita Sarkeesian talks about narrative. No. They both talk about both. The two are not easily separable. Do your research.
Actually, I've done quite a bit of research, but what I'm going to do is a little more research and present you with both what I already knew and what I learned. Now, I never heard of Jane McGonigal until I watched your video. I watched a couple of TED Talks by Jane. Gaming can make a better world, and the game that can give you 10 extra years of life. This comes from Jane's 2010 TED Talk, years before Anita Sarkeesian's Kickstarter.
I'm Jane McGonigal. I'm a game designer. I've been making games online now for 10 years, and my goal for the next decade is to try to make it as easy to save the world in real life as it is to save the world in online games.
So like Anita, Jane wants to make the world a better place and wants to try and use games to segue into this. But one key difference here.
I've been making games online now for 10 years.
For the past 4 years, I've been running a video web series on YouTube called Feminist Frequency, where I deconstruct the representations of women in the media.
Jane had already been making games for 10 years. I would assume she has a better understanding of games and its culture than Anita Sarkeesian. Jane already had more of my interest when it comes to games because of her background. Now let's look at gamer knowledge. First off, Jane.
This is a gamer who's on the verge of something called an epic win. You guys have heard of leveling up and +1 strength and +1 intelligence.
Epic win, leveling up, +1 strength, +1 intelligence. I can tell from this TED Talk, Jane understands a thing or two about video games. That was back in March of 2010. As it so happens, in May of 2010, just 2 months later, Anita posted this on Feminist Frequency. Bayonetta subway advertisements in Japan. She said this version is a slightly recut version of her video from 2010. She said she made a few jokes that were misunderstood and it created a torrent of hate via YouTube.
And of course she's lost her memories and there's some evil demon horde and there's a magical gem of the world, something, and so forth. All of that is besides the point when it comes to this game. First, the positive things about the game. She's a single mother and that's kind of it. As if this pornographic, overly sexualized, animated representation isn't bad enough, because it's basically a choose-your-own patriarchal adventure porno fantasy.
This sounds not only like someone who doesn't understand the source material, but it also sounds like someone who isn't interested in the game itself. One problem being factual inaccuracies.
First, the positive things about the game. She's a single mother.
And she tries to pass this off as misunderstood humor. If I had to judge Anita's 2010 Bayonetta video against Jane's 2010 TED Talk, I'd be more inclined to listen to Jane than Anita when it comes to video games. While I'm on the Bayonetta video, one thing I discovered with my research, research, the thing you claim other people need to do.
Do your research.
The recut version of her Bayonetta video was uploaded on her YouTube channel on June 4th, 2012, the same day she published her Kickstarter video. And it's an unlisted video, meaning you need the link to even watch it. You can't just go to her YouTube channel and watch it, you have to dig around for it. Given the problems with her Bayonetta video and the fact her Kickstarter was about video games, this comes across as distancing herself from something that could hurt her image. One of the overlying points I'm making is gamers already had a reason to take issue with Anita Sarkeesian, whereas with Jane McGonigal, they didn't. Now let's look at what problems Jane is trying to solve.
Gamers are super empowered, hopeful individuals. These are people who believe that they are individually capable of changing the world. And the only problem is they believe that they are capable of changing virtual worlds and not the real world. That's the problem that I'm trying to solve.
That's a good cause. Now we know Anita is trying to solve issues with video games, but she's also trying to deal with harassment. In her Kickstarter update earlier this year, she even stated she spends nearly half of her time on her harassment. Let's see what Anita is trying to solve.
The usual terms that we use to describe online harassment, such as cyberbullying, cyberstalking, even trolling, don't adequately describe a hate campaign of this scale. What happened to me, and sadly to other women as well, can best be described as a cyber mob.
I'm not trying to justify the harassment she receives, as it is uncalled for, but the thing is, Anita does a lot to bring this on herself. When you are a manipulator who wants to make a series of videos about a culture or material you don't care about or understand, it's not unexpected for there to be backlash. You see this all the time in the real world, yet mysteriously when it happens to a feminist like Anita Sarkeesian, people leave these factors out. You know, the people who tell us that we need to do our research.
Do your research.
Now, since Anita came on the scene, she started spinning this war on women narrative. It's a toxic, sexist culture that is trying to keep women out of gaming. Fortunately for me, you brought Jane McGonigal to my attention, who just so happened to do a TED Talk the same year Anita Sarkeesian did hers in 2012. These are both women giving public TED Talks about video games. One has likes and dislikes enabled, the other doesn't. One has comments open, the other doesn't. You also said they are talking about the same thing.
And before anyone says, that's not fair, Jane McGonigal talks about mechanics while Anita Sarkeesian talks about narrative. No. They both talk about both. The two are not easily separable.
Now just look at what I have set up here and listen to what Anita Sarkeesian said in her TED Talk. While playing this, ask yourself some questions. Is it a war on women, or is it an Anita Sarkeesian problem? Are gamers trying to keep women out of gaming, or is it an Anita Sarkeesian problem?
So what is the goal? Well, the immediate explicit goal is to stop the villain and save video games from me and my crazy feminist schemes. And they tried to do this by silencing and discrediting me and my project. But the larger implicit goal here is that they're actually trying to maintain the status quo of video games as a male-dominated space, and all of the privileges and entitlements that come with an unquestioned boys' club. The end result is maintaining and reinforcing and normalizing a culture of sexism, where men who harass are supported by their peers and rewarded for their sexist attitudes and behaviors, and where women are silenced, marginalized, and excluded from full participation. A boys' club means no girls allowed. And how do they keep women and girls out? Just like this. By creating an environment that is too toxic and hostile to endure. A growing cross-section of gamers and game developers of all genders are fed up with the way women are being treated in gaming culture, and they're speaking up to demand change.
If I can take two women who, by your definition, are talking about similar things, and the general public takes issue with one and not the other, that may say it's Anita that is the problem, and not a sexist gaming culture. Not to forget, gamers already had a reason to take issue with Anita. You learn these things when you do that thing you told others they need to do, their research.
Do your research.
I could also go into all the manipulative language Anita uses. Words like widespread and massive.
Then this overt display of misogyny on a grand scale. It's an overt display of angry misogyny on a massive scale.
This manipulative language in her TED Talk. It's in several public speeches or lectures she's given since her Kickstarter. It's littered throughout Tropes vs. Women in video games. This manipulative language serves to not only make something seem worse than it may actually be, but it also can aggravate people who know it isn't as widespread a problem as Anita leads others to believe. And despite this compelling evidence I present that there isn't necessarily a war on women, that has sadly become the narrative that is spun by the likes of Anita Sarkeesian. And after Gamergate started last year, others joined in on the narrative, with the likes of Zoe Quinn and Brianna Wu, as well as others such as Randy Harper, where the narrative is it's a war on women, and not just people taking issue with these specific individuals. So since you're talking about cultivation theory and how it can influence your worldview, and I can provide evidence to support my claim that the issue with Anita Sarkeesian are not based solely on her gender, let's see how media can affect your worldview when it comes to Anita.
The media you consume can affect your worldview. That's what the research says. The media you consume can affect your worldview. That's what the research says. The media you consume can affect your worldview. That's what the research says. The media you consume can affect your worldview. That's what the research says.
Most of Anita's media is about her harassment, not her work. The narrative she has crafted with all her media appearances is there is a war on women, a sexist gaming culture, widespread misogyny on a massive scale.
It's an overt display of angry misogyny on a massive scale.
That is to say, Anita's media appearances influence people's worldview on her.
It's hard to get anywhere in this conversation because people want to boil it down to, look, are you saying games are good for you or games are bad for you?
It's not as simple as people boiling it down to, are games good or bad for you? That plays a part in it, but it's not that simple.
Do your research.
If you are trying to educate me on Anita, why should I have a conversation with someone like you who doesn't do their research? All facts that challenge Anita's claims or the narratives that your side spins are mysteriously left out. Then you have the nerve to say it's hard to get anywhere in this conversation.
It's hard to get anywhere in this conversation.
And you spin a narrative of how others are boiling it down.
Because people want to boil it down to, look, are you saying games are good for you or games are bad for you?
What it boils down to is ideologues who have a worldview who don't want to accept reality for what it is. The reality is there are problems with Anita Sarkeesian that need to be addressed. Instead of trying to deal with those problems, you want to explain how people like me are the problem because I don't want to blindly accept what Anita Sarkeesian says.
Games are neither. They're games. They're culture. There are many axes on which they may affect you. A game can be incredibly positive in one respect and kinda problematic in another. And problems on one axis do not negate its value on another, and vice versa. And no major proponent of cultivation theory would argue with that.
Anita is the same way. It's not that she has nothing of merit to offer. In fact, I actually agree with some of what she says. It's that there are plenty of lies and manipulation surrounding her, and what your side wants me to do is accept everything she says instead of just the things I agree with. It's an all-or-nothing approach where her and Jonathan McIntosh refuse to budge, and instead of addressing those issues, you want to overlook them.
Okay, let's get back to the study. According to the theory, there are two kinds of cultivation effects. As I mentioned earlier, watching a lot of violent TV might make you think the outside world is more violent than it actually is. That's a first-order effect. Media has affected what you think is factual.
Watching enough Anita Sarkeesian videos might make you think video games and gaming culture are more toxic and sexist than they really are. Recently on Twitter, Brianna Wu said this: "One of the most disheartening things about GHC 15 was hearing firsthand from about 30 women keeping a low-profile career to avoid Gamergate. Now, as I demonstrated with the Anita and Jane TED Talk comparison, there is no war on women. It is people targeting individuals. And as is the case with Brianna, that article about Samus being trans was enough to bring backlash on her. People like Anita and Brianna bring it on themselves and then blame gaming culture. Then you have Anita Sarkeesian, Brianna Wu, and Zoe Quinn giving countless interviews saying it is a culture war.
The media you consume can affect your worldview. That's what the research says.
It is the culture that is a problem and not themselves. That there is a war on women.
The media you consume can affect your worldview. That's what the research says.
And that in turn create a worldview where women are now afraid of a gaming culture that they never used to be afraid of.
If violent TV made you think that violence is the right way to deal with adversity, that would be a second-order effect. Here, media has affected what you believe.
Just as watching a lot of interviews with Anita, Brianna, and Zoe might make you think this alleged war on women is worse than it actually is. The media people like you consume affects what you believe about the harassment narrative and whether Anita actually does anything to bring it on herself. With people like Anita, who lie and manipulate, it doesn't matter how hard she tries to fight the harassment. If she never shapes up her act, it will never go away because people don't like to be lied to or manipulated.
It seems a lot of studies into video games and cultivation theory focus on first-order effects, which I imagine are easier to study. So this was research into whether or not, over the course of a couple years, there were demonstrable second-order effects with regards to video games and sexist attitudes. The final sample was about 900 German teenagers, both boys and girls, with varying degrees of game usage. I'm not a statistician, but it seems like their math checks out, and the journal is peer-reviewed, so no complaints there.
One thing I'll add to this is this study doesn't disprove the claims made by Odysee, but at the very least brings into question how harmful some of the stuff can actually be. More on that later.
The study was conducted over the phone, where participants were asked to rate their agreement with 3 statements on a 1 to 5 scale, and then asked again 2 years later. The 3 statements were: the man should be responsible for all major decisions made in the family, in a group of male and female members, a man should take the leadership, and even if both partners work, the woman should be responsible for taking care of the household. That's the entirety of the sexist attitudes they were assessing, a very 1950s father knows best idea of masculinity. Across the board, they found no significant correlation between these attitudes and video game use. Average agreement with these statements was pretty low, and 2 years later, people disagreed even more strongly. It all seems pretty solid. I have no problems with the study itself.
I don't necessarily have problems with all the studies people on your side use either. Sometimes it's how they are used. I'm not going to open up that can of worms, as that would take me off topic. The point I'm making is just as how you take issue with how my side of the discussion uses this study.
It's possible by now you've heard of a study making the rounds that claims to have found no connection between video games and sexist attitudes. Perhaps you saw a link attached to a sentence like, John McIntosh's entire body of work is based on a lie. The people circulating this study are insisting that it officially disproves cultivation theory.
I could make equally compelling arguments about how your side manipulates information from studies on gender ratios in gaming to spin narratives that aren't factually accurate when you look at the details. The main one being that even if half of gamers are women, the type of games they prefer to play on average tend to be different than that of men, which is oftentimes left out of the discussion by those who want to educate on gender inequality in video games.
The problem with the conversation around this study is that it's really not applicable to the actual conversation about video games and feminism we're having right now. The closing paragraphs say, this study exclusively focused on second-order effects on attitudes towards gender roles.
The conversation we are having right now has a lack of research on your part when it comes to that of Odysee or Keesian. Even if a lot of what you said so far in this video is factually accurate, you excluded other facts, and that's either because you deliberately do it or because you didn't do your research.
Do your research. However, it may be that there are first-order effects on the perception of gender roles in society, or second-order effects on attitudes that do not relate to gender roles, but, for example, body image, sexual harassment, benevolent sexism, or rape myth acceptance. And these, and several other topics outside the purview of the study, are far more core to the current conversation than whether video games will turn you into the dad from Pleasantville.
I'm interested in where you are going with this. Please continue.
Studies into these topics are what get referenced in feminist articles about video games. These are the studies that get linked to in the Feminist Frequency show notes. The takeaway here is not that this study is bogus. This is a perfectly cromulent study into the relationship between video game usage and certain patriarchal gender norms. And this is a perfectly cromulent study into the relationship between sexualized avatars and slut-shaming. And this is a perfectly cromulent study into the relationship between objectification in games and the likelihood of harassing real-life women. The takeaway here is that none of these studies are in conflict with each other.
I have quite a bit to say about that section, so let's start off with the Feminist Frequency links.
These are the studies that get linked to in the Feminist Frequency show notes.
There are a few studies in here. The first thing on the list, though, is a TED Talk called The Sexy Lie. Caroline talks about some of the same things Anita talks about, such as the subject-object dichotomy.
In other words, is that person being acted upon as though she is a sexual object? When we're talking about sex objects, we're talking about dichotomies. When we're thinking about sex objects, we're thinking about the object-subject dichotomy. Subjects act, objects are acted upon.
Although it could be argued she may make some valid points, I don't know if I would have used this as a resource, but whatever. Then there's this one. It's time to leave the brothels and strip clubs behind when real victims fuel your narrative. This isn't even a study, it's an opinion piece on a gaming website called Polygon by Ben Kuchera. It even says opinion at the top. I don't think it even links to any studies from what I could find. It links to stuff like this from Al Jazeera America. Report: Louisiana policies help fuel HIV epidemic. What the hell kind of research is Feminist Frequency doing? Then you mentioned the Proteus Effect study.
And this is a perfectly cromulent study into the relationship between sexualized avatars and slut-shaming.
A Stanford News article about the study. Now, as far as the study itself, this is a virtual reality setup. The person is standing up. They have a formal meeting with someone else in this virtual world. It's not that it's an invalid study, it's a question of how does this apply to the games Anita talks about. Most people sit in a chair looking at a two-dimensional screen and have objectives within a game that aren't just formal meetings with another person. There is so much about this study that does not correlate with the games Anita talks about, bringing into question how much can this actually be applied to the games Anita is talking about. Now, something else I noticed while making this video that I didn't pick up on before. This link says sexualized avatars affect the real world. Stanford researchers find. It links to this article we just talked about, which links to this study. The embodiment of sexualized virtual selves, the Proteus effect and experiences of self-objectification via avatars. Now look at the names and the references. Going back to Anita's studies, look at this link. It goes to here. Look at the title of the study and the names attached to it. The abstract even starts out the same on both. Research has indicated that many video games and virtual worlds are populated by unrealistic, hypersexualized representations of women, but the effects embodied by these representations remains understudied. It looks to me like not only did Anita link to the study, but she also linked to an article talking about the same study.
Studied extensively.
And that's the thing about Anita's work. I can always go back and find stuff I missed. The amount of nonsense in her research just boggles my mind. The research you seem so proud to talk about.
These are the studies that get linked to in the Feminist Frequency show notes.
Not only is Anita's research lazy, but she finds ways to regurgitate the same research just like she regurgitates the same things over and over in her videos. Which brings me to another point. Look at how small her list of resources is. There are only 12 links here, and they aren't even all studies. It's like with Jonathan McIntosh and Anita Keesian, the goal is not to convince us with evidence, it's to present the bare minimum and convince us with words. They even said in the Kickstarter update they spend months making college-level theses for their videos. Their arguments have to be rock solid and bulletproof. They are more concerned with trying to convince us with words instead of evidence. This goes completely contrary to the scientific method where you are supposed to use evidence to prove your claims, not rhetoric. It's lazy to grab a handful of studies so you can say this in a video.
Studied extensively. Research has consistently found. Studies have found. Researchers have also found.
Don't you think Anita could have provided a little more than this with $158,000?
I actually raised 25 times what I initially asked for.
And look at the years of her references. 2013, 2014, 2013, 2013, 2013. A lot of this stuff didn't even exist when her Kickstarter ended in 2012. Some of these didn't exist when her videos were supposed to be finished by the end of 2012. This is more like just grabbing whatever sounds convenient for her arguments.
Studied extensively.
Even if some of her arguments are correct, her method is sloppy. This, on top of whatever other resources she links in other videos, is more like the bare minimum to make her arguments. That doesn't make her arguments rock solid. It's more like Jell-O soft arguments that were painted to look like rocks. Jell-O solid arguments. Now earlier, I talked about how you can convince people games are more harmful than they really are. I want to demonstrate that right now by going to Anita's second video, Damsel in Distress Part 2. I want to explain to you how Anita Keesian can cultivate her audience into thinking something that may not be factually accurate. First off, in this section, Anita talks about real-world tragedies.
It's especially troubling in light of the serious, real-life epidemic of violence against women facing the female population on this planet. Every 9 seconds, a woman is assaulted or beaten in the United States. And on average, more than 3 women are murdered by their boyfriends, husbands, or ex-partners every single day. Research consistently shows that people of all genders tend to buy into the myth that women are the ones to blame for the violence men perpetrate against them. In the same vein, abusive men consistently state that their female targets deserved it, wanted it, or were asking for it.
These don't really have much to do with video games, but setting that aside, after that section she says this.
Given the reality of that larger cultural context, it should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women in order to save them.
Did you hear how she said it's dangerously irresponsible to create games where you commit violence against women? The same violence you may commit against a man when you have to attack them to save them.
Even though most of the games that we're talking about don't explicitly condone violence against women, nevertheless they trivialize and exploit female suffering as a way to ratchet up the emotional or sexual stakes for the player.
They don't condone violence against women, but Anita defines it as still being an issue because of the significance of real-world violence against women.
Despite these troubling implications, game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches while consciously trying to figure out how to best misrepresent women as part of some grand conspiracy. Most probably just haven't given much thought to the underlying messages their games are sending. And in many cases, developers have backed themselves into a corner with their own game mechanics.
And she finishes that section by saying the developers themselves aren't necessarily nefarious, but she led into this by referencing real-world tragedies and saying what developers are doing is dangerously irresponsible. Even if the developers themselves aren't bad guys, they are now viewed by Anita's supporters as people who are doing dangerous things.
It's especially troubling in light of the serious, real-life epidemic of violence against women facing the female population on this planet. Given the reality of that larger cultural context, it should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women in order to save them.
The media you consume can affect your worldview. That's what the research says.
Now, to recap a couple things you said earlier, despite its limitations, the German study you are analyzing didn't have any real problems you could find.
It seems like their math checks out, and the journal is peer-reviewed, so no complaints there. It all seems pretty solid. I have no problems with the study itself.
Going back to what the study was about, the relationship between video game use and sexist attitudes. So despite the real-world violence against women Anita mentions, this study doesn't show much in the way of negative impact on sexist attitudes, yet Anita claims what developers do is dangerously irresponsible.
It should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women in order to save them.
So how is it dangerously irresponsible to have a mechanic in a game where you perform violence against a woman to save them? Where is Anita's evidence this is dangerous? Doesn't the study you cite at least bring into question how harmful these game mechanics actually are? Isn't it possible that it's in fact Anita who is doing something that is irresponsible by cultivating a mindset that these game mechanics are more harmful than they actually are? Now I'll cover this common core curriculum. Is gaming a boys' club? Women, video games, and sexism. This is something I've never broken down in a video before, and I'm not going to break down the whole thing today. I just want to cover a few things in it. The first one being learning objectives. Students will learn some background facts and information about the current state of video games. Students will reflect upon their own experience with gaming. Students will understand the role of women in video games and the specific way in which sexism is perpetuated in the gaming world. Students will express their thoughts by writing a letter to a video game company. That isn't as bad at face value, except for the next section, material. One of the links is to Anita's TED Talk that I referenced earlier in an article by Anita Keesian. It's Game Over for Gamers. The material revolves around Anita, who has manipulation and many of the things revolving around feminist frequency, including her TED Talk that is recommended.
Then this overt display of misogyny on a grand scale. It's an overt display of angry misogyny on a massive scale.
After learning about video games and women in gaming through Anita's manipulation, these kids are supposed to write a letter to a video game company. After a little bit of other stuff the kids are supposed to learn, we come to this section. Our experiences with video games activities. Post the statements written below around the classroom using printouts of our experience with gaming statements. And with the printouts, they would actually look like this. Big, huge, bold letters that are supposed to be posted around the classroom. Now going back to the list to read it off. I have watched other people play video games. I have played video games. I play video games on a regular basis, at least once a week. I have witnessed sexism in video games. People have said or done sexist things to me through video game interaction. I believe video games can have a negative effect on attitudes and perspectives in general. Didn't you just cover a study about sexist attitudes? I believe video games can perpetuate sexism. Didn't you just cover a study about sexist attitudes?
It seems like their math checks out, and the journal is peer-reviewed, so no complaints there. It all seems pretty solid. I have no problems with the study itself.
The study you referenced challenges the claims about how games affect sexist attitudes. We aren't talking about cultivation theory with this study, we are talking about sexist attitudes. I believe video games can have a negative effect on attitudes. I believe games can perpetuate sexism. See how this curriculum is structured to have kids read statements in nice big bold letters that ask them if they believe something? Not to forget, Anita Sarkeesian is all over this curriculum, which means there's probably manipulation all over it. If kids answer yes to these statements, they have been indoctrinated into believing what Jonathan McIntosh wants them to believe about sexist attitudes in video games, whether it is true or not. This is worse than cultivation theory. This is indoctrination. Even if these statements are true, this tactic of posting things in big, bold letters and asking kids if they believe it to be true can be used to convince them to believe anything is true. All you need is the right amount of manipulative language, and it fits right in with what McIntosh does, because he can technically say he didn't force them to believe it, as they chose to believe it of their own free will. It is indoctrination. Distribute at least 7 sheets of Post-it notes to each student. Give students 5 minutes to walk around the room and place a Post-it or round sticker on or near all of the statements that are true for them if they agree. If you have a large class, you may want to call them up in smaller groups. Then they're supposed to have discussions about the statements and such. Additional reading and resources. First off, feminist frequency. And almost all of these references come from 2014, and this one from 2012, all after Anita Sarkeesian came on the scene. And as I pointed out earlier, there was no War on Women narrative till after Anita Sarkeesian's Kickstarter. So the question is Anita Sarkeesian and Jonathan McIntosh's work about cultivation theory, or is it indoctrination? If you like this video, I have a playlist tackling Anita Sarkeesian and her work and encourage you to check it out. It also includes reviews of her Tropes vs. Women in video game series.
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms. Educational tools.
I leave my audience with one question.
Oh, did I win?